And so with that, I don't want to waste any of our time. Let me introduce our keynote speaker. I'm sure most of you are like me and you've been fangirling or fanboying. You've been a fan of Jay McTighe for a long time. He has a wealth of experience developed during a rich and varied career in education. He was director of the Maryland Assessment Consortium, a state collaboration of school districts working together to develop and share formative performance assessments. He's an accomplished author. Probably most people on here have read many, if not all of his books. He's co-authored 14 books, including the award-winning and best-selling Understanding by Design series with Grant Wiggins. His books have been translated into 10 languages, and he's traveled around the world presenting. He's also written more than 35 articles and book chapters and been published in leading journals, including Educational Leadership. Besides all of his academic accolades, Jay just has a heart as big as the ocean. He really cares about us as educators and helping us do a better job for our students in the classroom. So with that, I'm turning it over to Jay. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Cindy. You read it just as I wrote it. It's a joke. So welcome to everyone. A thumbs up if you can see my screen full bore. Can you see that, Cindy? Okay, very good. So I've been asked to share with you ideas for promoting deeper learning, and this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And I'll share ideas with you from 3 recent books that all relate to this topic. Here are the questions I'd like to explore during this opening session. What is deeper learning and why is it needed? I suspect I don't need to spend much time making this case since you're on this webinar. How does deep learning occur? I'll give you my take on that question. And then how can the use of authentic performance tasks and projects support deep learning? And one of the questions I hope will be of interest to you is what's the relationship between performance tasks and project-based learning? And then I want to leave you with a provocation based as a question. Are you ready for curriculum mapping 3.0? I think our profession should be. As Cindy mentioned, you can drop questions in the chat, and if time permits, I'll be happy to try to address them, and other speakers I know will be addressing questions as well. So let us jump right in to my first question. So what is deep learning and why is it needed? Well, interestingly, the phrase deep or deeper learning is out there in our professional lexicon, but it has different connotations. Some people think of deeper learning as learning more content. And you sometimes hear this from folks in higher ed who think that a good education means you've covered more topics in a textbook. I personally don't subscribe to that connotation. Another connotation has been promoted by people like Michael Fullen in his book on deeper learning, or the high-tech network on deeper learning and so forth. And this connotation suggests that deeper learning focuses on the cultivation of so-called 21st century skills or competencies, sometimes referred to as the 6 C's, and project-based learning is the mechanism for cultivating these competencies. And I'm a subscriber to this connotation, but I will say it's not the only connotation. And here's a third. This is from the National Research Council, and it's actually the definition that Harvey Silver and I have referenced in our book, Teaching for Deeper Learning. Here's what NRC says. Deeper learning is a process through which an individual becomes capable of taking what was learned in one situation and applying it to a new situation. In other words, this conception of deep learning is around transfer, that deep learning is evident when students can transfer their learning. And this is the definition that I have subscribed to. This is not to say I don't agree with Michael Fullen or the 6 C's kind of conception, but I would also point out that you can have outcomes that aren't in the 6 C's. You can be teaching toward academic standards in the traditional disciplines and still, and I think should, be teaching for deeper learning and teaching for transfer. So why is deep learning needed today? Why should we be preparing students for transfer? Well, I don't think I need to spend much time making the case, but I would like to highlight a few key ideas and trends. We know that the world is changing rapidly. We know the kind of world we're preparing today's students for is fundamentally different than the one in which most of us, grew up in. And some of these factors include the reality that knowledge continues to grow. The British intellect Buckminster Fuller reportedly coined the phrase doubling curve, the concept. And he proposed that from the beginning of recorded history to about 1900, the world's knowledge doubled. And then went on to estimate that from 1900 to about 1940, there was a doubling again of the world's information. Today, we're talking about more frequent doubling. Some people propose as much as every year or two, the knowledge base increases. Now, I'm not sure how you quantify that, but we do recognize that knowledge is growing in many fields. And yet our ability to cover all that content is roughly fixed the time with students. We also know that people, including young people, have access to much of the world's information on a handheld device. Now, I've never been one who says, oh, kids can Google anything they want, so we don't have to spend time teaching content information. I disagree. Every discipline has foundational knowledge and basic skills that need to be developed. Having said that, we don't have to cover everything that's possible to cover. There's too much, and students can access much of it. We also know that other trends are in the mix. One that I find fascinating is called the Internet of Things, more generally referring to the intersection of smart devices that are interconnected, coupled with big data and artificial intelligence. This is already transforming our world and will continue to. We know that over the last, 2 decades, automation has upended many industries, outsourced or eliminated jobs, especially those in the low skill work areas. But we're also seeing now high skill areas being outsourced to robotics, AI, offshored, et cetera. And finally, in my quick look at trends, we recognize that the world is unpredictable. The pandemic that we are still not fully over has been one of the most gripping experiences of our lifetimes, I suspect, and impacted the world, but it was on very few radar screens 28 months ago. It's a reminder that we're preparing students not for a stable world where we know everything they'll need and they can just learn it and give it back. We're preparing students for a world that's increasingly complex, interconnected, and unpredictable. This recognition is out there. For example, the World Economic Forum, one of many groups that have identified what they propose are the most important skills and competencies for a modern workforce. And you can find other groups with similar lists. They're highlighting things like the 6 C's as really critical. A number of schools and districts with which I've worked and with which I'm familiar have understood these trends, and in one approach, adopted a so-called profile or portrait of a graduate, asking the question, what capabilities and competencies do we really want to develop in our young people, knowing the world they will inherit? And these competencies are often the 6 C's. So we know these are important. In my work over the years with Grant Wiggins, Grant and I identified 3 types of goals for learning. These aren't new, they're interrelated, but they're not identical. And clarity among them, or between how they apply and how they differ, to me matters. So let me highlight the 3 goal types and make a brief comment on each. In the left side of my graphic, there are what Grant Wiggins and I have called acquisition goals. Namely, what knowledge and skills should students acquire when they're involved in a new learning experience, like a unit of study? Well, of course, every teacher should have goals and objectives to which they're teaching and for which they want students to learn. And those of you in public schools in the US, Canada, Australia, elsewhere, where there are either national or state or provincial standards, you are obligated to teach to the standards or the outcomes, and they specify, often in great detail, knowledge and skill objectives. But we also have on the right side what I've always called understanding goals. These are around the big ideas, the core concepts, and the key processes, both within disciplines and some that cut across disciplines, like critical thinking. And I hope you agree with me that a student might know something, as in the ability to remember it or give it back, but that doesn't ensure that they understand it or can apply it effectively. And so I like to distinguish understanding goals from just knowledge and skill acquisition goals. And finally, at the bottom, we have transfer, which is the National Research Council has shown us, or at least articulated. That is what we mean by deeper learning, preparing students to transfer, which to me is the basic skill of a modern era where unpredictability and rapid change is the norm. We want to prepare students who can not just give back information, but who can flexibly apply information and skills to new situations. So these are three broad types of learning goals. Those of you familiar with the Understanding by Design framework know that we ask teachers and curriculum teams to think about each when they're planning curriculum. And the clarity and the distinction among these impacts both how we teach, how students learn, and also how we assess. Look, if I want to see if students know things, I can give objective tests and quizzes with single right answers. Because if you think about it, knowing something, at least factual knowledge, is binary. You know it or you don't. But if I want to see if a student can demonstrate understanding, which I call deep learning, and can transfer that learning, then we need new situations, i.e. a performance task or project, to give us evidence that students can, in fact, flexibly apply their learning. How many of you are familiar with the name John Hattie, Hattie? Some of you know John. He's a researcher from New Zealand, spent his entire academic career, more than 30 years, 35 years, in fact, studying, teaching, and learning, and has written a series of books with the title Visible Learning, in which John describes what he calls the effect sizes of different teaching techniques. What impact on learning and achievement does cooperative learning or project-based learning or formative assessments have? Well, I've gotten to know John in recent years, and he sent me an article that I think relates to this webinar. John said, in all my years studying teaching and learning, I've concluded that we can think of three levels of learning. John says there's surface level learning, which he describes as learning where students are presented with new information by a teacher, or maybe they read it in a book or they view it online. But he reminds us that if students take in new information, but they don't do anything with it, it's not necessarily going to last. It can remain superficial and eventually will fade from memory. Then John says there's deep learning, which he defines as I do, as learning with and for understanding. But notice the graphic, deep learning is below the surface. And in my view, it takes time for students to really develop understanding of abstract concepts and processes. So deep learning takes time for the students, and we have to have time for them to what I call make meaning. And finally, John agrees with Grant Wiggins and I that the deepest learning is evident when students can transfer, when they can apply that learning to new things in a flexible and an effective way. So this is one of the leading researchers in our profession, underscoring ideas that are at the heart of this webinar. So let us look at this second question. So how does deep learning occur? We could spend hours on this question, and we don't have hours, but I'm going to give you a brief conception. Here's my contention. We can't just give a student a deep understanding that they're going to comprehend deeply and be able to transfer. Rather, understanding must be earned. It must be earned by the student in their minds. They make meaning, they come to an understanding. Now, that's not to say the teacher can't help them. In fact, the teacher's role is to facilitate what I call meaning making. And of course, there's a place for teacher direct instruction and modeling, but there's also a place when deep learning is our goal for the teacher to step back from off the stage on the stage role and become more of a facilitator through questions, through giving students opportunities to apply their learning and getting feedback. It's a more facilitative and coaching role for teachers. So again, for me, understanding must be earned. So let me give you a quick illustration of this involving meaning making. You ready? Have a look at the picture and the caption. Now, since I can't see or hear anybody, I put in a laugh track with the assumption that some, if not many of you, are chuckling or you get the joke here. But let's unpack this, because this is a subtle bit of humor. And let me ask the question, what do you need to know to get the humor in this? Because it's pretty sophisticated. Well, first of all, you need to know the game of chess. You need to recognize that the black and white tiles on the floor are representative of a chessboard. You need to know the figures in chess, including the queen and the bishop and how they move. And then there's a reference to the protocols of the Vatican and of the royal family. And so to get this joke, there's a lot going on. So symbolically, at least, I propose that this is how deep learning occurs. Deep learning involves students bringing to bear, to the forefront, if you will, their prior knowledge and experience to new information or new situations, and it involves thinking. Just like the cartoon, you're taking information about chess and royal protocol, you're connecting it to the picture and the caption, and you're making new connections. In other words, it's an active meaning-making process by the learner. Teacher can help, but the students got to earn understanding, or what I call deep learning. There's a lot more to say about this, but that's a little teaser. All right, let's go to this third question, because this is at the heart of this webinar. Defined Learning has developed a wonderful collection of rich performance tasks that can go into full-blown project-based learning. And so how do these relate? Why are these valuable? Again, I think you're on this webinar because you understand. Authentic performance tasks and projects promote active learner. The learner is actively engaged. They're making meaning as they work on tasks and projects. Well-developed tasks and projects engage students in authentic application, in using their learning, in transferring knowledge and skills. And the authentic quality of good tasks and projects also brings relevance into the classroom. And we know that students are more likely to put forth effort if they see purpose and relevance in what they're being asked to do. And good tasks and projects frame situations that are authentic and genuine. And finally, when we recognize and value the so-called 21st century competencies, often referenced as the 6 C's, these are how those are cultivated, through engaging students in performance tasks and projects. We're not going to develop these 6 C's on their own just by marching through a subject matter textbook. So these are the virtues, which again, I think you recognize because you're on this webinar. So let me jump to the fourth question. This is something that I have thought about a lot. I've written about. John Larmer and I, and you know, John Larmer is one of the literally the world experts in project-based learning from his days at the Buck Institute and then in PBL Works, and now working with Defined Learning. John and I have just written an article that we hope to get out, which describes the relationship between performance tasks and projects. So I'd like to explore these with you for a few minutes and see what you think. Let's start with a little quiz. I'm going to show you 3 examples, and I'm going to ask you to decide whether each example is a performance task or a project-based learning project. Okay, you ready? And you can put this in the chat box if you want. You can put PT or PBL. All right, so here's one. This is actually developed by Defined Learning, and the task or project is called Backpack Designer. Permit me just to summarize, because there's a lot of words on the screen here. If you're looking at it on a phone, it's going to be hard. So essentially, you're a designer working for a backpack company. Your goal is to design a new and unique backpack that will provide comfort and durability. You've got to sketch out your design, create a prototype, and then include a sales pitch to make the case that your backpack will be a bestseller. What do you think? Performance task, project. All right, here's a second one. Also a task or project developed by Defined Learning called Community Garden. Students play the role of community garden planners in a city. They calculate lot and plot sizes, amount of soil need, they create a site map, consider the water and fertilizer needs for various plants that could be grown. Then they create a flyer and prepare a presentation for an audience of community members to promote their community garden. Performance task, project. Here's the third of the three examples. This is a science investigation. The Pooper Scooper Kitty Litter Company claims that their litter is 40% more absorbent than other brands. You're a consumer advocates researcher who's been asked to evaluate their claim. Develop a plan for conducting the investigation, and your plan should be specific enough so the lab investigators could follow it to evaluate the claim of the company. What do you think? Performance task? Project? Well, you may recognize where this is going. John Larmer and I and others contend that it's not always so cut and dry, so black and white. Oh, that's a performance task, whereas that's a project. And so as an alternative to kind of trying to categorize, I propose that we can productively and beneficially think about a set of variables that apply across dimensions, if you will, that we can use to kind of decide how much of each of these variables we want to build into a task or a project. So think of the image of a sound or whiteboard, or a rheostat, where you can dial up or dial down the volume or the degree of illumination. And I've written about this in a recent book, and John and I have an article where we describe this idea as well. So let me just put forth a few examples. In fact, I think I have 6 of these dimensions or variables that can be considered, because I hope you understand there's no right answer to this. It's a matter of degree. So let's look at these variables. I'm going to start with time frame. So we can have performance tasks that are short in nature. I've seen really good, authentic performance tasks that could be done in 1 or 2 class periods. Most performance tasks tend to run a little longer, 3 to 4 days or periods, maybe longer. When we start getting into projects, in general, projects tend to be in longer term. Some of them go very long. And so that is a dimension, the degree of time involved in the task of the project. And that includes any time that students might need for presenting their work, which is more characteristic of project-based learning. So let's look at a few examples. Here's a wonderful performance task, in my view, called Making the Grade, developed by a 9th grade math teacher who is doing an introductory unit on the statistics strand in mathematics around measures of central tendency. In a nutshell, he asked the students, or he invited the students to tell him how their quarterly math grade should be calculated. They just simply have to explain whether he should use mean, median, or mode in the calculation. And that was a performance task. In fact, that was part of an assessment in his unit. Interestingly, he told the students in the beginning of the unit that they could do this. So as they're learning about measures of central tendency, they knew that they wanted to understand it so they could choose the method that would best support their grade spread. And by the way, not surprisingly, the teacher told me the kid's interest in understanding mean, median, mode went way up when he announced this. This was a one period task, even though he had forecasted at the beginning of the unit. But I would say it's authentic because the students are actually applying measures of central tendency to real world data, which is their grade spread for a semester or a marking period. Here is, let me see, I'm going to skip this one. No, I'm not. I'm going to go back to it. Sorry. Here's a mid time frame task called fairy tales for, let's say, third, fourth grade. You've just finished reading 3 fairy tales that all have the general pattern, same general pattern. Your task now is to write a fairy tale that includes the characteristics that we've learned, uses the same general pattern, and then you're going to actually take your fairy tale and read it to your second grade reading buddy to teach he or she about the characteristics and pattern of fairy tales. So from start to finish, especially if they actually went to the second grade, this might be a 3, 4, 5 day kind of task / project. I would still label this a performance task for reasons I'll get into in a moment, but it's a longer time frame. Now, check out this one. My daughter Maria taught at High Tech High in San Diego, one of the preeminent project-based learning schools in the country, if not the world. And 2 teachers team up and do a long-term project with kids. And one that she worked on with a fellow teacher was a tiny house project where the students had to research, design, and actually construct a tiny house that would be energy self-sufficient. And I believe it was to be erected in a park in San Diego, Memorial Day weekend. And they planned backward from that. It was a long-term, very multi-dimensional project. And I would call this certainly an example of project-based learning. So my point is, time frame is one of the dimensions, and we can have from short to long-term tasks and projects. Here's another dimension, degree of authenticity. Here's the question. To what extent is this task or project authentic? i.e., featuring a real world problem, challenge, or issue. Students are producing a genuine product or performance of the sort used and developed by people outside of classrooms, but also navigating real world constraints. And so you can have performance tasks that are not authentic, but they could still involve higher order thinking and student application. We can have, and often do, see tasks that are what I would call simulated authenticity. Kids aren't really a surveyor or an astronaut or a museum director, but they're doing a task that emulates what those people do. So it's a simulated authentic situation. And then we can have a task, and especially project-based learning, that in fact is truly authentic. Students are working on real issues, real problems for real audiences and producing products or performances that are genuine. So I'm going to come back to Backpack Designer. To me, this is a wonderful example of a rich, engaging, creative task or project, but it's simulated. The students really aren't, or probably are not going to send their backpack design to a manufacturing company, although they could. But it's a rich task nonetheless. Whereas the community garden example, if the kids actually did all these things and presented to a community group or a county council or a city board, it would be truly authentic. By the way, in my experience, I actually identify 2 dimensions of authenticity. So consider these. The first is a more general connotation that we use, which is authentic to the quote real world. In other words, are we engaging students in thinking and working in ways that reflect or replicate what people outside of school do? And by the way, the defined learning videos that just caught my attention when I first saw them is a remarkable resource for letting students think about real world application. But there's a second dimension of authenticity, which I also would like to highlight, and that is, to what extent does the task or the project or the assignment, for that matter, reflect students' interests and experiences and even cultures? The best tasks and projects, in my experience, have a confluence of these two dimensions of authenticity. They reflect real world competencies, but they also build in opportunity for student interest, experience, cultural relevance, and so on. Look, we can't always have both of these at a high level, but particularly when we're building tasks around academic standards in some cases, but it's a worthy aspiration. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm going to go to the third dimension here, which is, to what extent is the task or project involving multiple disciplines versus a single discipline? So in my experience, you can have a rich, authentic, engaging performance task that's nested in a single subject area, and that's fine. Sometimes we see tasks that integrate two subject areas, and one of the best ways of doing this is to have a science, social studies, mathematics task, technology-related task that involves communication. So whether it's written or oral or multimedia, you're integrating the communication arts and English language arts with one subject area. And then we can have typically longer term projects or richer performance tasks that in fact are multidisciplinary. So here are a few examples, starting with a subject-specific task. This is actually from my wife, Daisy, who for many years was a high school art teacher and department chair. And this was a task she did with one of her art classes. You've recently analyzed the narrative work of Faith Ringgold to identify ways she communicated about her world through her visual art. So the task then was to think about your own world, your family, friends, hobbies, interests, daily experiences, and select a drawing or painting medium or use mixed media to create your own narrative work that visually communicates personal ideas about your world. This was a rich task, occurred over about a week's time. A lot of student voice and choice in this, but it was nested in visual art. It was not a multidisciplinary task. And nothing wrong with that, by the way. So here's one that goes a little beyond. What's the pattern? Students are asked to interpret the data on coronavirus infections found on 2 selected continents over the past 12 months. And part of what they're asked to look at is not only the patterns of infection rate, hospitalizations, and even deaths, but look at variables in the countries in those continents in terms of government policies impacting the pandemic. For instance, were there lockdowns? Were there mask mandates? Were there requirements for vaccinations? And what, if any, relationship did these policies have on infection rates, hospitalizations, and deaths? This is a sophisticated, I'll call this more project-like, authentic for sure. And if you think about it, potentially involving mathematics, statistics, biology, government, and communication. So this is a multidisciplinary task. And often you see in project-based learning, that's a feature. All right, let's look at 3 more before I wrap up this general session. Direction. This is an interesting variable. Who will direct the task or the project? In my experience, shorter and more subject-specific performance tasks are typically directed by the teacher. In other words, kids are presented with a task. That's what they have to do. There are some tasks, however, where there's some student self-direction. Students can navigate the task a little bit, but it's still primarily teacher-directed. But when we start getting into longer-term projects and project-based learning, to me, one of the features is longer-term projects tend to be more student directed. So students are taking more of the leadership in terms of how they navigate the task or the project. In some cases, even starting from the beginning, what problem or issue are we going to tackle? And students would determine that and then generate and direct the project following their identification. So here are a couple of examples of each. Here is a case of a subject-specific task that's teacher-directed. In other words, it's given to the students. A summary of this is on the screen. Students are hired by a daycare agency to create and fence in a play area for children in the daycare. They're given a certain amount of fencing, information about the size and the gate, and their job is to create a playground space that will maximize the play area. And they'll have to explain their reasoning to prove that they have satisfied the task. Right, there's not a lot of student direction here, they're just given the task. And there's nothing wrong with that, given the goals of checking their understanding and ability to apply area and perimeter. Oops. Now here's an interesting, what I would call more of a project. Students in a government class in a school in Florida created a voter's guide in the fall of 2020, before the pandemic shut down many schools. And it was in conjunction, of course, with the presidential and congressional election. And they created a voter's guide, both in print form and in social media platforms. And while the assignment was given by the teacher, the students really were the ones that had to do the research and come up with the various products that were produced, again, in print and through multi and social media. Here is a wonderful project created by my friend Mark Wise, who works in West Windsor, Plainsboro district in New Jersey. He's developed this extraordinary project that's done the last week of 8th grade by middle school students, and it's based on the United Nations Global Challenge. In this case, students get to pick which global challenge they want to work on. They work in teams, and while there's a lot of resources provided, they pretty much need to direct the project all the way through. And the project culminates with their proposal for funding, and they have to make a pitch to a group of adult judges, kind of like the Shark Tank show, where they have to make a pitch for their funding and give their research, their rationale, their proposed solutions. So this is not only a long-term project, it simulates authenticity, and it's largely student-directed. All right, a couple more. Here's an interesting variable. To what extent will students receive support from a teacher as they work on the task or the project? Well, this, of course, goes back to its purpose. As you know, sometimes performance tasks are used as summative assessments. They're used at the end of a unit or even a course to see if kids can apply their learning to a task. And if that is the purpose, then it would be inappropriate for teachers to give students a lot of help and support unless they were, had an IEP and needed, special modifications or adaptations. However, if the main goal of the performance task is for learning and engaging students in applying their learning along the way, then teacher support is appropriate. Now, think about project-based learning, right? In the title of PBL, it highlights learning. Therefore, in project-based work, teachers are expected to support the students along the way, give them feedback, help them along, because it's a learning experience. Even though it may culminate in a product or performance that is evaluated, it is a learning experience. In fact, John Larmer has a wonderful concept. He says, every project contains a performance task within it, but it also has the learning elements. So there are lots of ways we can support students in their learning. For example, in this performance task, making the grade, I asked the high school math teacher, I said, this is so clever, I love it. And can I share it? And he said, of course, you can share it. But I said, I'm curious, how do you prepare kids for this? Now, I know you announce it at the beginning of the marking period. He said, simple. I give them, as part of their learning, some hypothetical student grade spreads. And with a partner or a small group, they have to look at the different student grade spreads and decide which measure of central tendency would be in the best interest of each of these respective students. And I deliberately set out the grade spreads to make them think about those distinctions. So that was a great example of preparing students to actually do the task, and in so doing, developing their understanding of measures of central tendency. But the kids had to do this version of the task as part of the unit assessment, and they had to use their own grade spread. So it was an assessment, but it was supported by the teachers teaching along the way. Here's another example of one of my favorite tools that I created. Let's say you're having a task or a project that includes argumentation. Well, in preparation for the task, I would teach the kids the elements of an argument, which is a claim. You have to have a clear claim. You have to support your claim with sound reasons, and you need to anchor your argument and your reasoning with evidence, sufficient and appropriate evidence. And so the graphic organizer of an argumentation table suggests that your argument is only as strong as your reasons and evidence. Now, you could use this as a teaching move, but you could also, if kids are working on an argument as part of their task or project, give them the table. Say, draft out your argument, see if it holds up. That would be an example of support. All right, a final variable for the time being is student choice. To what extent will students have choices regarding any of the following? The topic of the task or project, the target audience or audiences, product or performance that they're going to create, and even work mode. Is this something they can choose to work in groups? Can they pick their partners, and so forth? Again, there's no right answer to these. Daycare center was used as a performance task assessment done by individual students, and there wasn't much choice. Here, however, you could call this a task or a project, but irrespective, students get to pick a topic, research the topic, prepare, write their script, and then plan and conduct a TED Talk on the topic of their choice. So there's a lot of student choice here, although there are some constraints, which is the format of a TED Talk. So these are 6 of actually 12 dimensions or variables that I've written about in a recent book with the title on the screen. So I'm not sure I'm allowed to do a shameless plug, but it's easier to ask forgiveness and permission. But this book describes these variables if you're interested. So let me wrap up this session. How do we choose? What are we going to do? Performance task or project? Shorter term or subject specific, or longer term or student directed, etc. Well, again, no single answer to this, but here are the variables. What are the learning goals toward which you're working? Are you teaching primarily towards subject area standards and traditional disciplines? And/or are you working more toward the 6C competencies? That would influence what kind of emphasis you will have. Available time. Do you have 4 weeks that you can devote to a long-term project? Do you have supportive structures set up in your school or district whereby, for instance, teachers at the secondary level have time to collaborate to actually plan out multidisciplinary projects? And do they have time for students to present? And do they have time to look at student work in teams? These are the supportive structures that will support greater use of performance tasks, and especially project-based learning. To what extent do your teachers have the expertise? My experience is not all teachers are able, or that they have the capability, but maybe not the skill set to facilitate long-term student-directed projects. They may see the value of them, but they're not sure how to orchestrate them with 33 kids, the 33 ninth graders, in a 3-week project. And so we want to make sure that teachers have the skill sets to do this well. And finally, we need to be mindful of the students. Students who've gone through, quote, traditional school where they've been spoon-fed and directed by the teacher for almost everything may have a hard time being thrown into an open-ended long-term project that they're expected to direct. So clearly, there's a building block necessary for the skill sets needed to be successful by students. So these are the variables to think about when deciding where along the continua, if you will, of those dimensions we're going to play. John Larmer and I agree, in fact, we put this idea in the article, that we think that shorter term, more teacher-directed and subject-specific performance tasks are good starting places. They align with standards and they're more manageable, but we can use those as stepping stones to build both the teacher and student skill sets to get into more full-blown project-based learning. The beauty of defined learning is that they have a wonderful collection of these rich tasks, some of which are moving more toward projects or could be the basis for longer-term project-based learning. So I'm going to wrap up with this question. Are you ready for curriculum mapping 3.0? Let me briefly summarize what I mean by this. And there's an article that I think you can have access to or will be shared with you that gets into it more. So this has been my thinking. It's time for curriculum mapping 3.0. And here's what I mean by that. Curriculum mapping 1.0, which I would call first generation, was actually promoted by my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Heidi Hayes Jacobs. And some of you are old enough to remember her work that was in the late 80s, in fact, on diary mapping, where individual teachers were asked to map out what they taught for how long on a calendar. And the idea was, look, it doesn't matter what's in the curriculum guide or in the textbook. What really matters is what teachers are actually teaching. So to find that out, we'll have teachers diary map. Then the idea was we'll look at the diary maps and we can compare both horizontally and vertically. And maybe we find out, for instance, that at the elementary level, well, we didn't realize there were 3 dinosaur units being taught, K1 and 3, but the teachers don't know what each other is teaching. That was the purpose of diary mapping, to kind of get a better sense of what's actually being taught. And there's Heidi in the upper left. When standards hit big time in the 90s, diary mapping made less sense. What made more sense was what Heidi called consensus mapping, where teacher teams, grade level and department teams would get together, look at the standards, and from the standards map out the curriculum that they were going to collectively follow. On the screen is an example of such a consensus map for mathematics. Now, sorry, the type is very small, but this particular format did something very interesting for me. They looked at the standards and they generated the units, in this case for 5th grade math, based on the standards. They had a general time frame of how long each unit would take, but then notice the third column, they put in the performance task. I think this is really interesting. Rather than saying we're going to think about the assessment at the end, we're going to put forth a set of performance tasks that if kids understood the math in this unit, they could do this task well. Then they focused on the big ideas, the essential questions, and notice at the end, the textbook, which this district used to have a math textbook, is not the curriculum. It is a resource and it's placed appropriately as such. So this is a good format for mapping, I'd say. But let me leave you with my provocation. Curriculum mapping 3.0. In version 1.0 and 2.0, we're simply mapping out the content or the topics or the skills we're going to teach. What if we mapped out not just the scope and sequence of content, but what if we mapped out the performances we wanted students to be able to do with their learning? Hence, imagine maps of performance tasks and projects laid out across the grades, such that our goal in teaching is not covering as much as we can cover and talk fast in class because there's so much, because that would just result in superficial, often disconnected learning that doesn't last. what if we changed our conception that our job as teachers is more like coaches or extracurricular sponsors, developing student capacity to perform with their learning in authentic ways, including shorter term tasks and longer term projects. That to me is what a modern education calls for. So read my article and give it some thought. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with everyone today. And my shameless plug is for two books, in fact, Designing Authentic Tasks and Projects, and one that's more systemic in nature, Leading Modern Learning, which talks about how we fuse a modern day curriculum and assessment system, fusing the 6 C's competencies with academic disciplinary content. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I'm going to stop my share and turn it back, I think, to Cindy. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to address them in our remaining few minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, by the way, I'm looking, if you don't mind, Cindy, at a question from Nancy, who put in the chat. I'd like to challenge respectfully the idea that authentic learning can't always involve student interests, experiences, or cultures. Why not? I agree with I think her sentiment. We want to try to do that as much as possible. I guess my comment that it may be sometimes difficult is that, you know, in some subjects, if you're teaching a science concept or a math concept, it may not always be a natural fit. But I understand her sentiment. Let's try to connect to student experiences as much as possible. And I'll leave to you if there are any other questions that you have noted or want me to comment on.
Yeah, one request, Jay, was actually to show that previous slide that you had with the 2 books you were referencing. If you wouldn't mind bringing that up again, that would is a request from the audience.
I'm happy to do my shameless promotion. Let's see. Are you seeing that now on the screen?
We're seeing your, yes, there it is. So you got the.
Yes,
It'll come up in a second, or it should. All right, where'd it go? Let me try one more time.
and while you're looking for that, Jay, because we definitely want them to see that, we had a question from a principal who's starting to implement PBL and wanted to know, as you're starting, what's the frequency of projects they should encourage their teachers to do to make sure they're starting to develop that culture?
It's a great question. I'll give you my short answer. I have a 3-part mantra for doing anything new in schools or districts. Think big, start small, and go for an early win. Think big means 2, 3, 4 years from now, we'd like to have a project-based learning school. Start small and go for an early win means don't try to go too fast, too soon, too big with every teacher. I've just seen too many well-intentioned efforts going to crash and burn because it was too ambitious, even though the ideas and the goals were right. Start small. Maybe start with 1 project a semester and go for an early win. Try to build on things that your current teachers are currently doing, because presumably some teachers are doing some of this already, and or go to PBL Works or go to Defined Learning and find already well-crafted, well-developed projects with well-developed rubrics and advice along the way, and let teachers try those. Let the teachers choose which ones they want to try. That will be more of an early win potential than expecting teachers to craft their own project on their own and do it without any experience. So that's my suggestion for getting started.
It's wonderful advice. Someone asked about, is there some academic data around the impact of PBL on student achievement in the US? And if you don't have time or want to answer that, I encourage you to stay with us in this series, because we have 2 superintendents coming in to talk about what's happening in their districts. But do you have an answer to that, Jay?
I would give them your answer.
Okay, all right, that's fine. And then another one, what about?
Oh,
what
by the way, let me elaborate on that, however. I have a little bit of a bone to pick with, this may sound non-academic, I want to be careful, but a bone to pick with people that say, if there's not research behind it, I'm not going to do it. And so my bone is, yeah, so what is the evidence that we're looking at? Are we looking at scores on multiple choice state tests to determine if an intervention or an initiative is successful? Because if that's the evidence we're looking at to decide, then I would propose that those measures are impoverished and are not likely to yield the impact of a well-developed project-based learning approach. So that's my pet peeve on the question of research.
I agree with you, Jay. I mean, there's so much more to a kid than a state test score. And I think all the people here would agree with that as well. It's just sometimes our people in charge need to see a little data before they take a chance. And
Agreed.
then the last question, someone asked, how do you support English language learners to have equitable access to PBLs? And I would say, how do you support all kinds of, how do you differentiate with PBL?
It's a great question. A couple of thoughts. One is, and I've written about this with Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson on differentiation. We can differentiate tasks and projects by virtue of, you can have the same overall goal for the task or the project, but you can differentiate potentially the target audience, the product or performances that kids produce, and the work mode and the degree of support they get. So for example, for an English language learner, what if they produced a picture book for primary grade children using limited English language that they have and pictures, whereas other kids might be doing an information brochure for teenagers, or letting them present their information in their target language if they're beginning language learners and just don't have the language capability to do a TED Talk in English, and giving them appropriate support through graphic organizers, through large text, through scaffolding and so forth that's appropriate to enable them to have some degree of success. I think we can have authentic learning while being mindful of the recognition that we have a variety of learners and some need more support than others.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jay. We had great participation, we had great questions, and we really appreciate your assistance. And we'll start with the next session in 1 minute. So thank you guys for being with us.
My pleasure.